Hello and welcome to the first episode of a new show where people talk about science fiction and artificial intelligence. My name's Burrage and I'm the science fiction kind of expert side of this. I host a show, a podcast called the Science Fiction Book Review Podcast, and I'm bringing some knowledge about science fiction and novels and other things like that. And joining me is, of course, Sid. So introduce yourself, Sid, and say what you're bringing to the course.
Yeah, hi. So I am Siddharth Krishnan. I am a professor of computer science, particularly specializing in artificial intelligence, machine learning, data analytics. So in some sense, I am bringing the science aspect. And in this series of episodes and this podcast, our goal is to kind of investigate the intersection of science fiction, AI, and other concepts in computer science that pertain to science and science fiction.
That's right. And this is the first episode. In fact, this is the first time that we've done a podcast recording. Although he was a guest on one of my podcasts when we talked about podcasting, interestingly enough. And he's a listener to my podcast. But the whole point of this is every episode or every book or movie or TV show or work of science fiction that we discuss from the point of view of, thinking about artificial intelligence, there's going to be 2 episodes. The first episode of each one is the book introduction or the movie introduction, where me and Sid, we've already read it or watched it or, have a way to talk, a little bit to talk about. We'll introduce what the book is kind of about, some initial thoughts of it and why you should read it and why we're picking this book. Episode 2 will be recorded in about a month's time. And that is for the people who've read the book and want to join in a discussion where they can talk to Sid and talk to me and ask questions, and we'll have some of and this will also be recorded via Zoom meeting, and we can have different people asking questions, and that'll be more of a free-ranging discussion on the topic at hand. And so, without any further ado, let's introduce the book. Well, it's not really a book; it's more of a novella, isn't it? It was actually I thought it was a short story. When I recommended it to Sid, I was like, here's a good first episode. It's all about artificial intelligence. It's a short story by Ted Chiang, and Ted Chiang he's a multiple award-winning author, to the point where normally, if he released a book for a good span of years, if he released a short story or a novella, it would just win the Hugo Award, it would win the Nebula Award, and these are like the Hugo and Nebula Awards are like the 2 main science fiction awards for literature. But then he also wrote a story which was turned into the movie Arrival, and that won a Hugo for dramatic presentation. So he can't help it. Every time he releases a book, it wins the awards and gets turned into movies and things like that. But this, weirdly enough, is a bit longer than I remember. I thought it was a short story. It's actually a novella, and so I listened to it as an audiobook. It was about 2.5 hours as an audiobook, so I was expecting about an hour's reading experience, but it was actually a bit longer. I hope that wasn't a problem for you, Sid. You read it as a paper book, I think. Is that right?
That's right. So yes, it was a beautiful book. Thanks for the recommendation. I wouldn't have known. Of course, Ted Chiang, I got to know of Ted Chiang when the movie Arrival came. That's how, it's like, this movie, it's so critically acclaimed. Let's go on and look up and find out what's the story about. And then you find out that there's this guy called Ted Chiang, who is a computer science person by training.
Yeah.
Who has gone on to have a very successful career as a short story writer.
Yeah, and, he doesn't actually write novels. This is about as long as his work gets, because he has these really strong ideas. Weirdly enough, I actually think even though I think this is a very interesting book, very thought-provoking, I actually think it's one of his, I don't want to say weaker books, so I'm just saying or weaker stories, but there's many other stories which have stuck with me longer, even included some of the stories in this book, the Alchemist's Daughter, no, was it the Alchemist's Gate? I can't remember, I should have looked up the other stories in this short story collection. But if you want to read this, it's available in the Ted Chiang story collection called Exhalation, and this is the longest story in Exhalation, but there are some other really good stories in that collection too. But this is the one that we're talking about, because this is the one that's specifically about artificial intelligence.
Yeah, he has a knack for packaging his ideas in the short story form and leaving with leaving it with an impact, leaving the reader with an impact.
Yes.
I think so. And novels usually, when they're adapted to movies, aren't very successful because they have to edit out many parts.
Yeah,
but
too much is cut out. You're right. Yeah.
So short story to movie adaptation is fantastic. So and he's got this knack of being able to pull it off very effectively.
Yeah. So let's talk more specifically about this work. You said before that he actually worked in software. I looked up his Wikipedia page here, and it said he was a technical writer in the software development world, and which is very obvious in the title of this book, The Lifecycle of Software Objects. Software lifecycle is something that, you always see the diagrams of what is it, like you come up with the idea, you do the analysis, planning, then design, implementation, maintenance, whatever it goes on, and there's always this loop that goes around, and then you start the next project, and the life cycle continues on. Yeah.
Right. I think it also fits the title and the kind of the theme of our podcast. And Luke, you're a programmer, and to all the students who are listening...
No. Let's say I'm not a programmer. I do some scripting, I do some web scripting, I do some game development, but I am not a professional. I'm not trained in software development at all. I'm a professional juggler, as you can see by this juggling stuff on the wall behind me here, if you're looking at the video. That is something that I'm not an expert in. It's just something I have developed over the time. Yeah.
Let me paraphrase. You have done some programming, so you understand.
Yes, that is true. That is true.
Yeah. And to all the students who are going to be listening to this podcast, essentially, one of the first things that they teach students in a software engineering class is a life cycle of a software.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Right. So I think it's quite, and that sets up the canvas for illustrating all the different concepts involved in this life cycle. So, and objects as entities in programming or instances and instantiations of classes in object-oriented programming, things that you basically give a rule and structure, and then you instantiate a class of that object.
Yeah.
And since you and I have read the story, it's such a remarkable and technical yet all-encompassing title for that short story.
Yeah, it's very clever, and this is the thing. It's because this is written, and this is it always so annoys me when I read books or see science fiction. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to, one of the many reasons I thought this would be a good first episode or a good first science fiction work to work with, is because it's about software written by someone who is a software professional. So it has things like really obvious things which are not ever obvious. It never seems like this is obvious in normal science or other science fiction about artificial intelligence, which is like version control, where they're like, oh, we'll just roll it back. Like, oh, what were the latest commits? Oh, we did this thing. Oh, roll it back to the last backup. Roll it back to the last checkpoint. Like this is like really obvious stuff for anyone who's ever worked with software or even played a video game. You're like, oh no, I jumped off a cliff and I can go back to the last save point. That is baked in. Like these software ideas are kind of baked into what the story is about, and that is it. And again, just to talk, more broadly before we get into a little bit more detail about why we've picked this story as the first one to talk about in terms of science fiction and artificial intelligence, is that it is like it's about it's looking at artificial intelligence as software. However, it doesn't really it's also about people. It's about conscious software and all of that. How is consciousness made? How is all of that? All of that is happens before the novel, and this kind of jumps in at the point where oh right, we're doing we're doing development, we're training, and then deployment, and then later on, as as happens in software in the real world, what happens when stuff is end of life or sunsetted, and some things become obsolete, and you close the services, and you get all the the Internet of Things, where people's fridges don't work anymore because they can't contact the servers. All this stuff which is happening now in as we know software works. That is all addressed in the book in a very clever way. Go for it.
Absolutely, and I think. One of the interesting things that Ted Chiang addresses in this book is this philosophical question that most researchers in artificial intelligence are asking these days, is that is intelligence a trainable property, or is it an emergent property? Is it something is that kind of generalized artificial intelligence going to come as a culmination of multiple training that you do for these artificially intelligent entities, that they're going to collectively come together and have an emergent consciousness, right? So there's this, and he teases that out really well, along with some interesting other questions. And when we talk about the specifics of the story, at least the broad strokes, before we get into the discussion, I'll bring up some points that I noticed.
Yeah. Well, I just want to, as we getting like sort of a bit more into this, again, reasons why I picked this story as the first one we should do is because this feels like classic science fiction, even though it's kind of very up to date in kind of like software ideas and things. It feels classic science fiction because it's artificial intelligence in a way which we don't think of artificial intelligence now. Like now when you say, oh, we've got some, like my phone has an AI chip in it, it's got a machine learning chip in the phone. These days in like 2021, we never think, oh, that means my phone is conscious and has feelings. Like what we think of when we hear the word AI now in 2021 is very different from when even this book was written in 2007. Actually, let me quickly look it up when it was published in 2010, so probably written roughly around about that same time. But yeah, like this book is the classic, oh, what would happen if computers have feelings? What would happen if a robot could smile? What would happen if, a robot could fall in love? Those kind of questions, which feel very classic artificial intelligence style, like science fiction, which these days, if I said machine learning if I say now AI to anyone, they immediately think, oh, I have AI on my phone, it makes my camera work better. And these days we think of artificial intelligence as like a tool that helps us just do something slightly better, or Google is AI, but we don't think it's conscious. And that's why I like this. It's probably the last and one of the best examples of what would like artificial intelligence meaning a conscious being that thinks and has feelings and can be a standalone unit. Whereas now we don't think that of Siri. We just think, or when you say, hey, Google or whatever, like we don't think of those as things with feelings. They're just helping us do the job. And this is one of the last novels or one of the last stories that I can think of where it's like the old style or like the 1990s version of what we think AI should be. Any thoughts about that, Sid?
Absolutely. I think you're bang on with that interpretation of how the word AI has been thrown willy-nilly these days. Right?
Yeah.
So in some sense, for the most part, what we do now under AI, and I'm throwing air quotes when I say this, is that it's basically advanced statistical properties that can be achieved on large amounts of data with the immense computational power that we have now.
Yes.
So people were thinking about some of these statistical properties almost 50 years ago.
Yeah.
But now, but at that point of time, they had only synthetic data, not real data, and they did not have the computational power that we have these days with the tensor processing and the graphics processing units being used for computation. So now is a world, the reason why neural networks and some of these concepts have become more mainstream discussion is because these technical units, neural networks, have evolved to something that can actually be developed by software engineers because of the data that's available, because of computational power that's available. So, at a very basic level, Siri or Hey Google are natural language processing, which is basically allowing a computer to just communicate with a human being in the language of their choice. Right?
Yes.
So it's natural language communication. So, and you're right in the sense, AI's definition has been so. I don't want to use a negative word, but instead I'll say the definition of AI has been more encompassing than what we understand as AI when we were reading Isaac Asimov and
of course,
and the
robot
robot series back in the day.
We will get to some other stories which actually, weirdly enough, written way back in the day, but are actually more about big data sets. We have some other stories on the list that we're going to get to. So some like classic short stories which talk about like some of the first views of like the big data and how to sort through big data to get through them. We actually have some things to talk about there. So yes, I understand that like when we say AI now, most people don't think, Isaac Asimov robot, I can't do harm to humans. And actually, that's another thing that I wanted to bring out now is that a lot of the book, Lifecycle of Software Objects, is talking about ethics, like the AI ethics, like artificial intelligence ethics. Now, if I was to say that in 2021, and I say ethics in artificial intelligence, I'm thinking most people would think, well, the data sets have to be, in this way that like, these police are using this thing of facial recognition, and it can't just be all the data sets can't just be white men. There has to be diversity, there has to be inclusion. And I found it really interesting to read one of these stories, which again, it feels like one of the last of the things, sort of like, but if it's a living being, we can't harm it, we can't cause it pain if you turn it off. Is it living anymore? Is it murder to turn off an AI? And I think these days, if there was a similar story written about artificial intelligence now and ethics in artificial intelligence, I think it would be much more from the point of view of like not allowing harm to humans by artificial intelligence or machine learning or data analysis, big data analysis or whatever it is, but not in the way of like Terminator. These AI things are going to try and wipe us all out because they're jealous of us or whatever the motivations of evil AIs are. So yeah, that's another way that I thought this story was kind of in that classic form of sort of like, we can't mistreat the AI. And in 2021 in the real world, we're like, we can't let AI mistreat humans. It feels like the world has kind of flipped around in the last 10 years since this was written.
Yeah. So one thing that I have noticed is that in the artificial intelligence research community these days, most of fairness and ethics in AI revolves around bias. So to ensure that there is no bias in the data sets, there's no bias in how the models are being trained on these data sets, but none of them do address this concept of, if we do have an AI system that's collecting data and is doing what it's supposed to do, if we turn it off or we euthanizing something, that's not
the thoughts. That's not even touched upon now when we're talking about ethics in AI. Okay, so in this last little bit of this introduction podcast, is there anything that you want to like flag up in the novel, which is sort of like that you think like warn people going in, or like mention things as like to set up people's expectations of this story before we finish up on this first episode?
There's one very interesting thing in the very beginning part of the story that I want to talk about, and this way I'm not revealing any suspense or anything that happens in the story. So the story is set up where there's a person taking a new job as an animator, and in that, when they take the job, they say that they're taking that specific job because they like the philosophy of the company that they're joining. And the philosophy that they're saying is that experience is the greatest teacher. Something to that, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
And one thing that is very consistent with modern day machine learning as we teach it now in the context of actual science as opposed to science fiction is that we do say that the models these days are just as good as the training data. So if you can train and the data sets are more efficient, they have the properties that you want the model. And when I say model, it's the machine learning model, or it's this artificial intelligence entity. It's a black box that you can teach. And if you use the right data and teach it the right things, then you expect that the performance will be consistent with that. So it's nice that the starting point of that story is actually exactly where current science is.
Training data.
The training data. And it evolves beautifully to address other topics and it kind of guides the reader in a vision of AI that is definitely possible. And that's one thing I really liked. Like at the beginning of the story, they hit something that everybody who's working in the field of AI or who's even learning AI is familiar with, and then takes off from there and asks thought-provoking questions. What do you think, Luke?
That didn't jump out at me because, again, I'm reading it from like a science fiction reader's point of view and not an academic. No, I just like some of the world building in this I think is really interesting. A lot of it is based on like Second Life metaverse. And I just realized, I just heard, I think it was Mark Zuckerberg saying, oh yeah, we're going to go deep into virtual reality and we're going to make our own metaverse, all talking, pretty much referencing exactly Snow Crash by, is it Neil Stephenson?
Neil Stephenson.
Yeah, Neil
That's
Stephenson.
Right.
So I'm just saying, like, some of the stuff that's kind of mentioned in this book feels weirdly current to this modern day. Also, I noticed something which was current. It actually said at one point there was the latest flu pandemic, and the economy went into recession. And I'm like, wait, this was written in like 2009, and it's like, and everyone had to be at home. But there is one thing which I just want to mention of that, which again, it's not really a spoiler, but what happens is they say, and because the economy went into recession, they closed down this virtual space. And I'm actually thinking in the modern day, that's actually the other way round. Like, we're recording this on Zoom, and the reason why Zoom is suddenly a really important company is because of a pandemic, and then everybody needs more virtual spaces and more virtual tools and more online stuff. So while I think a lot of this is, I enjoy the world building, especially in these digital spaces, and the compatibility issues in the online spaces, and how popular they are as people take their little AI creatures. I mean, we didn't really talk about the book much, but it's all about AI creatures and training AI creatures as though they're small children or pets or however it works out. So and one other thing about that, there are some, I'm not sure if we need to do trigger warnings, but there are some icky moments later on and throughout this book, because put it this way, if you're working with things on the internet, you're going to run across things on the internet which sometimes people are unsavory. So there's a few times in the book where unsavory things are mentioned or described, and it's not that explicit, but I just want to put that little warning in here. Kind of internet level unpleasantness happens at some points, just being described. You don't actually see it. It's not actually super foregrounded, but it is mentioned. And yes, and so I just wanted to mention that as well. Anything else?
Yes. So I think since we're doing this as a two-part, it would be nice to maybe have some sort of teaser questions that we would like the readers to think about, particularly students.
Okay.
So I would say, can you come up with 2 questions that you think are conceptually intriguing to you? And I will come up with 2 questions that are conceptually intriguing to me. And I'll do it from more a technical standpoint. And maybe you can do it, not that you should not do it from a technical standpoint, but from a philosophical or a storytelling standpoint.
Okay.
So that way we bring in these 2 perspectives, leave the listeners with 4 questions to think about. And of course, we encourage new questions as well.
Hey, this is the pilot episode. I didn't know you were going to spring some ideas on me. Okay, so one question I'd have is, what is AI for? And in this book, it's quite clear that they're struggling to find a purpose for conscious AI, and I think that's going to come up many times as we do this series of podcasts and discussions when we talk about this thing. Like almost every story about artificial intelligence, there's always this, but why are we making artificial life, or why are we doing this? And this book goes over that. So I think that's kind of, it's not so much a question, but like when reading this book and then thinking about it is like, what is AI for? And you could be talking about the conscious version of artificial intelligence, or the dumb but very clever and helps us do jobs kind of machine learning one. So I'd say that is one question. Like again, it's almost so broad it's meaningless, but I think there's some good answers in this book as you read through it. Like what are these artificial intelligences for in this book? Let me put it that way, in this story.
It's an excellent question. I think what's interesting is while you say it is a broad question,
Yeah.
I think at the end of the story, you realize why that's one of
Yes.
the most pertinent questions to
Yes.
ask. So it's a
right.
very good question that
Yeah.
that I think
All
everyone
right.
can think
What's your
of.
first question? Your first question.
I think my first question would be, all right, so I was talking about training data set, right? So if I were to have an artificial intelligence model, so let's not think of standard machine learning models like logistic regression or classification or any of those things. But
all these words that I don't know what mean.
That's fine. I'm sure some listeners will catch on, especially the students, right? So
Yeah.
if there was an AI model, how would you go about designing multiple different training data sets that can assist that model to learn how to behave in different situations? And I think that's a very interesting question. Versus, let's say you give it image data versus, let's say you give it text data. How do you process those things differently, or things that you can ask?
Yeah, because that is actually one of the things that is there's like 3 different kind of models of these AI, like versions of these AI, and some of them are better at one things and some of them are better at the others, which I see why you're asking that question. Okay, my second question here is more about user interface, because I always find this fascinating. Like that's one of the things that really most annoyed me about the book Snow Crash, where the metaverse comes up is a lot there. It's because they want to have a meeting, so instead of just sending each other a link and both clicking a button, they actually have to go into virtual reality and then get on their skateboards in virtual reality and then go down the street in virtual. And I was like, what's going on here? This book is a little bit more clever in that way, because it kind of acknowledges that these are constructs. And what I like is that they give them big eyes, these big cute soft animal bodies and things. And so my question is should there be signals, if you're developing artificial intelligence, or if you're a user and you're using artificial intelligence, what do you think the correct signals should be to you that you're using artificial intelligence? Because at the moment there's no user interface. When you type into Google, it just gives you an answer, and you don't know is that a human giving you that answer or anything else giving you that answer? And I just want to bring up, because it's mentioned in this book about why these little animals look like they do. And is it serving the software developers? Is it serving the artificial intelligence, or is it serving the user? And I just want to put that in people's brains. What does interacting with artificial intelligence look like? Of course, we all know from the movies it's normally a humanoid robot-looking person, or it's just a disembodied voice like Mother from Alien and all the TV shows which rip off Mother from Alien.
That Siri from Her, there's a science fiction movie that there's Joaquin Phoenix.
We might even discuss that.
I think we should talk about that. We should talk about that.
It's on my list. It's on my list of stories or things to talk about. So, So that's my thing. What should it look like? Should there be a universal sign to say, we have a Wi-Fi sign. If you see the Wi-Fi sign, you know that. If you see, a volume slider, we know what that volume, the little symbol for that. Is there something that we could put in place for AI? You are now communicating with AI or using AI. Should that be needed? Maybe it isn't needed. Who knows? Anyway, your second question.
My second question is that the book talks about having smaller entities of artificial intelligence. It's not spoilers, it's more a technical term in the book. They call it genomes. And they use that to synthesize, the artificial intelligent objects that are in the story. So the question is, if there are simple statistical models and we can continuously tune them to become better models. For instance, recurrent neural network is a very simple neural network entity, but then the more it trains, the more you modify it, you can start making it better. And then there's something called a convolutional neural network, which is another entity which is designed for some other specific task. The question is, can you realistically envision, and this need not be an answer that the students might get from the story, but this is something I think we all should think about, especially if we're getting technical in this field of AI, is to see if these molecules or these units or atoms of artificial intelligence can be combined and constantly improved to a state where we can get back almost cyclically to answer the first question that Luke phrased, which is, what is conscious AI?
Yeah.
That's
Maybe.
that's the kind of question. Yeah, I
right,
don't
okay.
think there's a direct answer to it, but it's something
again,
to think
these are
about
more-
as it goes on.
As you're reading the book, think about this kind of stuff. Okay, so that's about 30 minutes, and this is about how long we said we'd do these introduction podcasts for.
Absolutely. And on the record, I do want to thank Luke for this collaboration. Us from the Department of Computer Science at UNC Charlotte are grateful to you for agreeing to spend your time and working with us on this. I'm sure it'll be a fun series to produce.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm really looking forward. The thing is, I'm most looking forward is to getting other people in on this call because, of course, we can chat about this stuff, but I want people to have read the book and then we can then assume people know the story or don't mind the story being spoiled or whatever. Like I say, this story is the Lifecycle of Software Objects. It's a novella by Ted Chiang. You can read it in like an hour and a half, 2 hours. Again, if you get the audiobook, it's on offer. You can get the full short story collection from Audible. And it's like $10 on there, or you can get the Kindle book. My girlfriend Juliana, she got it from the library app that she has and just read it for free. So check out a library app if you want to check this out. And again,
since I know you well, I'm going to correct you in saying your wife Juliana.
Oh, okay, yes, she is my wife. I keep forgetting that. So yes, we again recommend this story, and also we recommend the other stories in the short story collection. However, I don't think any of those are about artificial intelligence quite as clearly as this one is. So, Lifecycle of Software Objects by Ted Chiang. Read that. You've got about a month. We're going to do the discussion. When did you say it's like at the end of August is when the semester begins again? Is that correct?
That's right.
Right. So we'll be doing it. We haven't set a time yet, but it'll be probably at the end of August or the first week of September. So that's it. If you're interested in other discussions, me and my girlfriend Juliana, or my wife Juliana, as we say, we have our own podcast. It's called the Science Fiction Book Review Podcast I mentioned at the start. And you can find that at sfbrp.com if you want to have just general reviews. Every book that we read, every science fiction or fantasy book that we read, we discuss. The episodes are sometimes a bit longer than this. They go like 45 minutes to an hour or an hour and a half, depending on what we're talking about. And we really get into the weeds of those books. So if you're interested in more of my voice, you can find it over there. Not just me, again, it's me and one other person, but not Sid. Anyway, Sid, thank you very much for this interesting discussion.
The sfbrp.com, if you go in, it has a list of episodes, and Luke and Juliana have talked about a lot of episodes that do talk about artificial intelligence as it is seen in science fiction. So you can be selective. You don't have to listen to them all. But I highly encourage, if you want to listen to more content about how science fiction perceives artificial intelligence and how you all can extend your imagination from what you learn in class into what artificial intelligence can be or cannot be. That's a good repository to draw some information from.
And he really means you don't have to listen to them all, because I've been doing it for 13 years now, and we've just yesterday we recorded episode 462 or something. So really, you don't need to listen to thousands of hours of Luke and Juliana talking about science fiction. Let's wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for listening or watching if you're seeing the YouTube version of this, and we'll catch you next time.
All right, bye-bye.